All right. Good morning, everyone. And this is attempt number two to get this live stream going. My Instagram is being a bit finicky, so my apologies for that. I'm just going to pop over to my Instagram. So just there we go. All right. And thank you for being patient if you were hanging out with me. And it looks like we are live on all of our platforms. So, welcome, day two. Happy Tuesday. Yesterday, I kicked off my series on archetypes and how to fully embrace your whole self. So, again, I just wanted to reinforce because I know the amount of training and knowledge and study that those that actually do this work as analysts is incredibly intense and very in depth. And really, I just wanted to be able to share what I've been learning and how I would like to apply this into my world, into my work, to myself. And I just want to be able to share that knowledge with people because I find it incredibly fascinating. So, again, I want to reinforce that in no way am I providing any kind of advice or any sort of professional guidance on this. It's more just as somebody who's interested and has had a chance to look at some of the literature and can provide resources. And would love to just get into conversation and discussion with you as you learn with me about archetypes and how that might be showing up for you and how it might be impacting you and what you're discovering as we go on this journey together. So, first of all, I just wanted to say that I want to thank Scott Jeffrey, who I've actually been looking at a lot of his resources. I believe he is with his company is called CEO Sage. So I really want to give a shout out to all the work that he's done to provide some really excellent professional guides on this topic. And he's also provided some great resources. So I really appreciate all the information and guidance that he's provided. So just to kind of recap from yesterday, I kicked it off with just an introduction to archetypes. And some of you may have heard the term before, some of you may have not. And so just a couple of definitions that I've learned as I've been reading this and from hearing somebody, a Jungian psychoanalyst actually speak about this, is that archetypes can be thought of as templates. They can be thought of as motifs sometimes. They're also in the Greek language, they were also considered primer forms. So, in other words, they are these kinds of templates that help to shape our personality, and they are universal. So that's the thing that's interesting about them is archetypes are universal. So we all possess similar archetypes, but what's also interesting is that we will all express them differently. So each of us individually, as we take on these different archetypes, will also express them differently. So archetypes actually play a big role in who we are in our personality because they do influence the way that we think, the way that we feel, the way that we behave, and they'll also influence the way that we interact with others, our relationships with them, and also with ourselves. And so today I want to talk a little bit more about just those, more about the subunits. We're going to get a little bit more granular. But one of the ways to think about archetypes is, and I love this definition, is that they are the subunits of our personality. So there's all these different aspects and components of who we are, and archetypes are the thing that actually comprise that. They're also what we could think of as the secret force behind human behavior. And in fact, yesterday I shared a quote, which was that, in fact, we're probably, if we think about our cognitive activity, we're actually about 99% unconscious versus that 1% of conscious. And the quote that I wanted to share with you today is the one from Shakespeare. And some of you may have heard this quote before, but the quote is, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. And one man in his time, or let's say one person, individual in their time, plays many parts in Acts being seven ages. And really, that is an interesting and I think very accurate way to encapsulate what I'm learning about archetypes is that through different stages of our life, we're going to be playing different roles, and different archetypes are going to be more predominant than other ones. And if you think about just your own life journey, depending on where you are right now, we are playing different roles, and different roles become more important and more prominent, and they're usually of higher priority. So I think of when I used to do career development work, there was a study that actually talked about these different stages of our career and the choices that we would make, and that usually at each decade of life, particularly as we get into the adult stages of our life, sort of at 18 and beyond, each one of those decades, there's usually some kind of significant change that happens, and that would impact our career decisions and what we would do for our career. And I think that that ties very closely to this concept of what Shakespeare talked about in his quote, which is that we do have these different roles, and at certain points in time, we exit from some of these roles and then we enter into new ones. For those who are parents, that is a very significant role that you have as a mother or a father, and you will be on stage to play that role. And then at some point, as your children get older and are able to function on their own, then you exit that role and you step into a new one. So we see that when we hear about people talking about being an empty nester, what that means to be an empty nester, and how their life changes significantly. So one of the things that I wanted to touch on today is to talk about some of the more basic elements of archetypes and some of the terminology. So there's quite a bit when we look at Jung's work and what he talked about, but some of the more common terms that you may have heard of is the dark side, right? If we think of the light and the dark, that's a very sort of simplistic way of thinking about how we might categorize some of those archetypes and how we might view them. And again, if we think about popular literature and we think about just pop culture, Star Wars is a really great example of that, right? Because we have, and I talked about this yesterday, we had Luke Skywalker and the relationship between his father, Darth Vader, who we didn't know was his father, but we had the Force, and we also had the dark side of the Force. And similarly, we can think about that with our own personalities, with archetypes. We have the light and the dark, and sometimes we also call that the shadow side. Jung actually had sort of three very basic sort of elements that he talked about when he talked about personality in terms of an individual, and he had terms for them, and I'm just having a look in my notes, so just pardon me while I have a look in here as to what those terms were, because some of you may have heard these terms before, and I just wanted to just grab that. So yeah, so Jung talked about what's called the shadow archetype. There's also the anima and the animus archetype, and there's also what he calls the self. So these are the three different types, I guess, parts of the individual that can show up. So, and I think in particular, what's interesting is to think about the shadow side, because the shadow side tends to be the one that we have difficulty being with, difficulty certainly embracing. And I speak for myself, and I don't know how many people would say that, yeah, I love talking. I love being with my shadow self, because we tend to label that as something that's quite negative. And in reality, one of the things that I learned, which I thought was really fascinating from our um, guest speaker with one of my mastermind group, was he spoke about, in order to be really our most authentic and fully integrated self, we need to be able to embrace all aspects of self. And so I think that that is such a, to me, that was such a profound insight, because how many of us actually struggle with, first of all, understanding those different parts of ourselves. And secondly, being comfortable with and embracing all those different parts of ourselves. If we look at the sort of current world that we live in right now, one of the criticisms of social media has been that it has actually lent itself to a lot more mental health issues with people, because it's all about this comparison. So for quite a while, and I think it's sort of evolving and shifting and changing with greater acceptance and more safety around people being vulnerable. Typically, I think about Facebook. Facebook tended to, in the beginning, just show our our most best selves, and in many ways it was somewhat fictional or superficial, right? Because we didn't want to talk about the things that weren't going well. We just wanted to show everything that was going well, almost a bit like Pleasantville, right? Nothing bad ever happened. But the reality is that we are the product of all those different life experiences that we've had. We are the product of having incorporated and having been many different types of archetypes. And so I just wanted to have you think about that. So what are those parts of self that you struggle with, or that you tend not to really want to examine or be with? And perhaps those are the aspects of self that actually have the most to inform us, right? I think about a colleague of mine when I worked in pharmaceutical sales, who was a teacher in a former career. And when he first started teaching, he actually wanted to and had asked for assignments where he was working with those students that were labeled as ones that weren't going to really be able to perform very well, or had some kind of learning disabilities or challenges, and weren't performing well. And his colleagues would say to him, like, why would you want to like teach those kids? Like, why don't you want to just teach, like, don't you want the assignments where you teach the kids that are doing well, that are really great academic performers? And he said, well, why would I want to do that? Because he said, how does that actually prove my ability, or really strengthen my ability to be a teacher? So I thought that was a really interesting perspective. And I think that that's also a perspective that we can take with ourselves, is to say, what are those parts of ourselves that we tend not to look at, or tend not to want to be with, but what does what do those parts of ourselves teach? What can they teach us? What have we learned, and how has that shaped the person that we are? So that, I think, is something that is really an important part of that aspect of fully embracing ourselves, is that these are all parts of ourselves. So, having done a little bit more of an in-depth dive into it, and I want to also say too that I think the other term that we might use, in addition to that, the shadow side, the dark side versus the light side, is that we could also think of it as our, in some ways, although I know it's not completely the same, you may have also heard the term of the higher self and the lower self. And I think that that can also be part of this when we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and how we evolve ourselves from making sure that our basic needs are met. And as those basic needs are met, we then move up that pyramid, if you remember the diagram, the pyramid, towards self actualization. And I think in the process of reaching self-actualization, we are moving towards more complete or more comprehensive integration of all those different aspects of self, all those different archetypes, and really then um, embracing, as I said, all of that, and giving ourselves permission to be all of those things. And what's interesting is that, again, in the reading that I was doing, there's a commentary around how one of the challenges that we're facing right now in the modern world is that there has been this separation between conscious and our unconscious. And just grabbing the quote as we speak, and the comment here is that, and this is from a Jungian analyst by the name of Robert A. Johnson. And he says, the inner life that Jung described is the secret life we all lead by day and night, in constant companionship with our unseen, unconscious inner selves. When human life is in balance, the conscious mind and the unconscious live in relationship. There is a constant flow of energy and information between the two levels as they meet in the dimension of dream, vision, ritual, and imagination. And if you can, and I've got some lovely ringtone in the background to go along with that quote. The disaster that has overtaken the modern world is the complete splitting off of the conscious mind from its roots in the unconscious. And I think we need to continue to remind ourselves that a lot of our behaviors, our thoughts, and our beliefs, and the way that we build relationships with others and are interacting, it is driven from the unconscious. I mentioned yesterday, the challenges that we face in creating greater diversity, equity, and inclusion within our society and within organizations has a lot to do with unconscious bias. And so I just think it is such a powerful thing to be able to undertake this journey and task of the inner work. And so again, when we talk about the inner and outer self, right, the higher and lower self, right, the higher self is, in my mind, as we move towards greater self-actualization, we start to realize that some of these voices from the lower self, we can actually make choices about how we want to be with those voices. So got a few minutes left because I want to be able to complete at the top of the hour and meet that half-hour commitment. And I want to talk about just these archetypes. So there are, just to let you know, there are literally, as I've discovered in my reading, literally thousands and thousands of archetypes. Any kind of description that we could think of when it comes to some kind of a personality or behavior or emotion could be considered an archetype. And again, I want to give credit to Scott Jeffrey, who compiled and had a document called The Ultimate List of Archetypes. So thank you, Scott, because you've made a lot of my work and research into this so much easier. But want to start first of all that sometimes people will talk about Jungian archetypes, and they will talk about sort of ones that he did, although they are not necessarily ones that he put forth, but are often sort of attached to him. And here's some very simple ones I want to share with you. So as I said, there's the self, there's something called the anima, the animus, the shadow, the persona. The persona is kind of like a mask. The persona is the mask that we present to the outer world. And in fact, there's actually a assessment tool that I work with that actually talks about persona, and that we have different personas, and that we select and often very consciously choose different personas depending on the context or situation that we're in. Some very common ones that we could all relate to in terms of archetypes: the father, the mother, the child, the wise one, the sage. We could sometimes call it the hero, the trickster, the maiden. These are some very common ones that you might have heard of. And we can see personas coming up in different places. So, for example, tarot cards are a form of archetypes, right? Some people are really into that. Right? We also have Carolyn Miss or Mace actually has a whole set of uh, cards, a deck of illustrated cards with 80 different archetypes. And there's a whole list of those ones. There's one from Carol Pearson, who has written a book called Awakening the Heroes Within, and she has a 12 archetype model. There is also something called the Enneagram. So I know that I have colleagues who work with the Enneagram, and the Enneagram is also an example of different archetypes as well. So there are literally a whole host of different archetypes. And what I want to do during the time that we have together through this program is we're going to explore some of these different archetypes. And I would love to be able to hear from you. How, how have you noticed that archetype playing out for you? How has it shown up for you? Because again, we all manifest them differently. The archetype has a template or a blueprint, if you will, of behaviors, thoughts, emotions that are associated with it. But again, each of us are going to manifest that very differently. So would love to hear from each of you as we go through the series together. What's coming up for you as we explore each of these different archetypes. So I hope that you have found this interesting and informative, and I would love to hear your comments on it. And again, I will be here tomorrow at 8:30 to go into day 3 of archetypes and how to fully embrace yourself. So thank you for joining me. I've really thank you. Riley, my massage therapist, is here. Thank you. He said, very good insight speaking about subconscious and conscious behavior. Thank you, Riley. We had such an interesting conversation when I met Riley, and I want to give a shout out to you, Riley, because you are an amazing massage therapist, very insightful and committed to your clients. So thank you for joining in. And again, I will see you all tomorrow. And if not, I hope you enjoy this recording. Take care and bye for now.